Segment 2A, Introduction. We begin the formal lecture part of this class by taking a look at the world as it was around 1500 AD. The year 1500 sounds suspiciously round. In fact, the year 1500 itself wasn't much different from 1499 or 1501 or any of those other years. But if you look 50 years before 1500, 50 years after 1500 AD, you'll encounter a great deal of relevant historical development. The last half of the 15th century saw the fall of the Byzantine Empire, or, if you prefer, the Eastern Roman Empire. It saw the creation of the Russian Empire, first known as Muscovy, and it saw Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. The first half of the 16th century saw the Portuguese discovery of Brazil, the Reformation of the Western Church, and the high point of the Ottoman Empire. The United States of America was not even a gleam in anybody's eye, but the United States' creation and development depended greatly on the events we're going to be covering in this lecture, so stay tuned. In segment 2B, the Old World 1500 AD, we examine the state of the European world before the Age of Discovery. The Byzantine Empire had wheezed to its sad end in 1453. Itself a continuation of the Roman Empire, and they believed that they were the Roman Empire. The Byzantine state was replaced in spirit, if not in physical form, by the rising Russian Empire. Western Europe was likewise in chaos, as France and Great Britain were pummeling each other to death in the so-called 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War also ended in 1453. France became an absolute monarchy in which the French king literally was the law. Great Britain had to undergo a round of civil wars before resuming its status as a constitutional kingdom. Italy, meanwhile, was so fractured into city-states that it was incapable of concerted action. The only truly stable nations were Spain and Portugal. This fact enabled Spain and Portugal to search for new markets and new sources of materials in the mysterious land called the Indies. Segment 2C, the New World to 1500 AD, introduces us to life in the Americas before the Europeans arrived. To the south, the mighty empires of the Mayas, Incas, and Aztecs demonstrated that Native Americans could and did build magnificent civilizations and even magnificent empires. Had their weaponry been equal, the Spanish conquistadors may well have been sent packing by the Incas or the Aztecs. The simpler lifestyles of the Northern American Indians is more difficult to reconstruct due to the lack of written records and the shortage of major monuments. But the lives of the Northern Americans were no less fascinating, as any visitor to the Cahokia Mountains, which are just across the river from St. Louis, could tell you. To claim, as the Europeans actually did, that the indigenous people of the Americas, the so-called Indians, were without any culture is just flat-out absurd. In segment 2D, Wave of Exploration, Europeans make their way to the New World, also known, thanks to an obscure Italian explorer and his German map-maker buddy, as the Americas. The Vikings were the first Europeans to reach North America, as early as 1000 AD. Spain came next in 1492 AD, followed closely by the Portuguese. At one point, the Pope even signed off on a deal splitting the New World between Spain and Portugal, the Treaty of Tordesillas. Once they got their domestic affairs straightened out, and this was in the middle 1500s, the French and British began exploring the Americas. Even the Dutch and Swedish tried carving out modern American empires in New York and Delaware, respectively. Eventually, Britain, France, and Spain would battle it out for control of North America. And ironically, all three would lose. Segment 2B, The Old World, 1500 AD. The decline and fall, really, of the Roman Empire. By 600 AD, the Western Roman Empire was gone, leaving behind the Eastern Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines had carried on Roman traditions for centuries, but by 1100 AD, they were losing territory rapidly to the rising Ottoman Turkish Empire. But that was not their only problem. The Crusaders supposedly came to reclaim the Holy Land from the Turkish Muslim quote-unquote infidels. But in fact, the Crusaders were more interested in fighting the Byzantine Christian believers, or to be more precise, heretics. In the 12th century, Byzantine trade was also cut off by Italian shippers, while agribusiness interests drove the poor, independent, individual farmer out of business. The peasants provided the Byzantine state with less and less revenue, which made it hard for the Byzantines to maintain a viable army and navy. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the Roman Empire had come to its definite end. On a more positive note, the stream of refugees from Constantinople included scholars with their priceless ancient manuscripts. Once settled in Italy, these scholars stimulated a new human-centered interest in the ancient past, as opposed to the old Roman Catholic fixation on sin and salvation. This revival of worldly or secular learning kicked off the Renaissance, which in turn kicked off the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment provoked a renewed interest in public affairs, which would directly influence the founders of the United States of America. Moscow and the Mongols. Far to the north of Constantinople, the young Grand Duchy of Moscow wanted to follow in the Byzantine Empire's footsteps. The Russian, or Rus to be more precise, culture had emerged in the late 800s around the city of Kiev. In the mid-1200s, nomadic Mongols conquered Russia and ruled Russia like a subject state for 2 centuries. As the Mongols weakened, the city of Moscow grew in power and influence. Grand Duke Ivan III of Moscow, who came to the throne in 1462, drove the Mongols off for good. He then founded the Kingdom of Russia with himself as Tsar, or Caesar. Ivan's wife, a Byzantine princess, encouraged Ivan's ambitions until Ivan began thinking of Muscovy as the third Rome, after Constantinople and Rome itself. Ivan III also saw Russia as the protector of the Eastern, or quote-unquote Orthodox Christian Church. To Russia's west were 2 dangerous enemies, Poland and Lithuania. Both of these nations practiced Western, or Roman Catholic, Christianity. To Russia's south, the Ottoman Turks had reached their greatest power under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Because Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ottoman Empire were all on the rise, Western European nations which wanted land or new markets could not expand eastward. To the south lay Africa and a fringe of strong Muslim regimes, and after that there was desert. If the Western European nations wanted an outlet for their excess population, they would have to look elsewhere. France, England, and Italy. The year 1453 marked not only the end of the Byzantine Empire, but the end of the 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1453 between France and Great Britain. Although the war did not go on continuously, both nations were exhausted, and they both needed time to recover. Because of the number of powerful French nobles killed, the King of France was able to take over the entire French government. Under the French monarchy, the people's rights were what the king decided the people's rights were. Even after the French economy bounced back, exploration was still decades off in 1500. Great Britain's recovery got off to an even slower start, thanks to a 30-year civil war between the York and Lancaster factions. Neither faction will be on the exam. In 1485, Henry Tudor unified the British throne and began undercutting the position of the British nobles. As opposed to the autocratic French kings who were the law, King Henry of England worked with Parliament to establish his dynasty's position. Britain was a parliamentary democracy. This was important for the history of the United States. And when this parliamentary democracy was established, then Britain could think about its own empire. Italy, meanwhile, was dominated by 5 wealthy city-states: Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, and the Papal States, which included Rome. They shared the Italian language and an Italian heritage. They liked to think of themselves as modern Romans, but they were basically busy fighting each other for land, money, and new markets. Fearing that one or another of them might become too powerful, they got involved in a dizzying pattern of alliances and wars. This is the cultural background of Machiavelli's 1505 masterpiece, The Prince. Do unto your enemy before your enemy does unto you. For economic or political reasons, many Italian captains made their mark exploring in the service of other nations. Italy herself would never make much of a mark in the New World. Portugal and Spain. The French, the British, and the Italians weren't ready to look across the Atlantic just yet. But the Spanish and Portuguese were ready to take advantage of advances in navigation. In 1487, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Diaz conquered traditional naval fears like boiling seawater, falling off the edge of the earth, and angry sea monsters, and sailed as far as the southern tip of Africa. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain backed Christopher Columbus's dream of reaching India by sailing westward. Of course, Columbus found the land of Hispaniola instead, and technically, only technically, the Americas. Word got out that new lands were waiting to be discovered and claimed. In 1498, the Portuguese Vasco da Gama successfully reached India by sailing around Africa. He came back to Portugal the next year with a load of spices, which not only brought a huge profit, but touched off a frenzy of exploration. The fleet sent by Portugal in 1500 to follow up on da Gama's discovery was blown off course and wound up in what is now Brazil. Wow. Portugal became a major player in the New World completely by accident. Soon, all the seafaring nations of Western Europe had the technology to sail across the Atlantic and around the world. They had pilot books, the magnetic compass, and the astrolabe, which measured the angle of celestial bodies from the horizon. Their ships were mounted with cannon which fired iron balls or even stones, and could wreck an opposing ship or a fortress from a pretty good distance. The European explorers claimed to be on a quest to Christianize the so-called savage heathens, but this was more of a pretext than anything else. They were more interested in gold, spices, and whatever other riches they could extract from their new discoveries in the new world of Terra Nullius, nobody's land. It's ours now. The voyages of Columbus and of Vasco da Gama had in effect shrunk the world and begun the process of globalization. A wave of exploration was about to begin. But before we discuss it in greater detail, we need to examine life in the Americas before the Western Europeans arrived. Segment 2C, The New World, 1500 AD. When the first Western Europeans reached the Americas, they saw it as terra nullius, land belonging to nobody, and therefore open to exploitation. But belonging to nobody was far from the truth. The latest estimate of the Americas population in 1500 AD is 40 million people, which is roughly the estimated population of Western Europe at the same time. Most of this population lived in Central and South America, where mighty empires such as those of the Aztecs and Incas emerged. The Aztec and Inca empires, as we will see, left behind a large, magnificent legacy. Sadly, we have much less to work with concerning the North American Indians. Yet, the original natives of what are now the United States and Canada have left behind an important legacy of their own, which we will also explore. Empires of Central and South America. The Aztec Empire would be more accurately called the Toltec Empire, for this is the name the so-called Aztecs used for themselves. Around 1250 AD, the Aztecs, to avoid confusion, arrived in the vicinity of modern Mexico City. And by 1375, they'd successfully founded there the capital city of Tenochtitlan. From 1440 to 1500 AD, the Aztecs successfully acquired an empire which they basically exploited for the elites of Tenochtitlan, a city which reached a population of around 300,000 people. One of the Aztecs' conquests was the fabled Mayan Empire, which some date as far back as 400 BC. The Aztec king ruled his empire with a strong and bloodthirsty hand, backed by a strong military. Yet the Aztec Empire was already falling apart when the Spanish conquistador Hernando Cortés arrived in 1519. Although Hernando Cortés had been ordered not to attack Tenochtitlan, he did just that in 1519. After kidnapping King Moctezuma II, Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire in 1522. Spain was able to begin shaping its newly acquired terra nullius into a full-fledged overseas empire. The beginnings of the Inca Empire are mysterious as well. It seems their rise to power began around 1200 AD as they gradually acquired power over neighboring peoples. At this point, the Inca Empire extended for roughly 2,500 miles along the western coast of South America, encompassing much of modern Peru and Chile, with parts of Ecuador. Its population at that time is estimated to be about 1 million people. The Incas were usually satisfied to rule by proxy and gradual assimilation. That is to say, they allowed local rulers to retain control over their peoples, as long as these local rulers paid their taxes, sent soldiers, and obeyed the Incas. The city of Cusco in the Peruvian highlands was the center of a large bureaucratic government connected by an excellent road system. At the center of the government was the Inca, son of the almighty sun god and supreme master of all of his subjects. You could say he had some serious imperium. In 1521, the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro set out with a mere 200 soldiers to conquer the Incas. 200 well-armed soldiers. Pizarro emulated Cortez's sleazy tactics without enjoying Cortez's success. Pizarro started by kidnapping the Inca, Atahualpa, whom he tried to use as a puppet ruler. Finally, Pizarro executed Atahualpa in 1533. By the 1560s, after a long and difficult fight, the Inca Empire had fallen to the Spaniards, adding to the territory taken from the Aztecs. Having wiped out a second great American empire, the Spaniards were again busily exploiting their new improved terra nullius. The Indians of North America. The earliest known Indian culture in the eastern United States is that of the Adena, which appeared in the Ohio River Valley around 1000 BC. The Adena began building burial sites and fortifications around 600 BC. The Adena culture was replaced or absorbed by the more advanced Hopewell culture, who built more prolifically and seems to have traded extensively. Around 500 BC, the Hopewell culture gave way to the Mississippian or Temple Mount culture, best represented today by the ruins surviving at Cahokia, Illinois, a city right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. In fact, the term Cahokian has sometimes been used to denote this culture. By the 1100s, as the Byzantines were fighting off the Crusaders, Cahokia may have had as many as 20,000 people living in a town centered around a huge earth mound which exists to this day. Like the Hopewell culture, the Mississippian culture relied on hunting, agriculture, and trading. The Mississippians may even have held slaves. For some unknown reason, Cahokia is thought to have been abandoned by 1400 BC, but its remains are a mere 3.5-hour drive from the Missouri State University campus. Well worth seeing. In what is now the southwestern United States, the Anasazi culture, ancestors of the modern Hopi Indians, settled down in the Four Corners region around 500 BC. They lived in stone and adobe pueblos, often across cliff faces. In the Pacific Northwest, the tribes of inventively named Northwestern culture, I like that, Northwestern culture, were known for their potlatch festivals and enjoyed plentiful supplies of food and fish. They may have lived in villages as early as 1000 BC. In the eastern half of the modern United States, a diverse grouping of Indian tribes lived in the heavily forested regions back from the sea, exhibiting equally diverse types of cultures. As a general rule, Indian cultures across the modern United States had a particular reverence for the earth. The earth not only provided them with their livelihood, whether they were hunters, planters, or gatherers, but it played an important role in their various religions, to judge from their surviving myths and legends. To the Indians, the earth didn't belong to anybody in particular, but to everyone in common. This conception was, of course, completely alien to the Western European mind. Neighboring tribes maintained relations with each other much as Europeans did, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. The major difference, of course, was that the Europeans came to the Americas bringing guns, horses, and alcohol. Segment 2D, Wave of Exploration. Early arrivals. The first Europeans known to have reached the New World were Norsemen, better known to us as Vikings. They were traveling west from Greenland, where Eric the Red had settled around 985 AD. Eric's son, Leif Erikson, may have reached the northeast coast of modern Canada around 1000 AD. Far to the east, in the northwest corner of modern Russia, Norsemen had already been ruling the infant Kievan Rus state since 862 AD. Unlike the later European arrivals to America, who intended to settle down and exploit, the Norse were just passing through in the great Viking tradition, looking for a few cities to sack and some farms to pillage, and when they got bored, they left. The Norse oral tradition includes tales of a land called Wineland the Good, and to this day, some still believe that the Norse voyagers traveled much farther south along the Atlantic coast than was previously believed. The Western Europeans who came to the New World were looking for very specific things. They had heard of the gold, slaves, and other material wealth to be obtained in the quote-unquote Indies, and each nation wanted to get there first. They yearned for the eternal glory of Christianizing the heathens, and they yearned for the worldly fame of getting there first. None of these explorers suspected that another landmass lay between Western Europe and Eastern Asia. The name America itself comes from the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose letters about his trips to the New World created widespread popular interest. On the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller's 1507 world map, the New World was named America in honor to honor Vespucci. Even though Martin Waldseemüller quickly came to regret assigning the names North and South America have stuck to this very day. Portugal and Spain. Under the guidance of the far-sighted Henry the Navigator, 1394 to 1460, Portugal kicked off the wave of exploration. Looking for new lands and new markets, the Portuguese weren't strong enough to fight the other Europeans on land for them, so they had to look longer and harder and farther away. The accidental discovery of Brazil didn't hurt either. Although Columbus reached the New World first and claimed it for Spain, Portugal's hard work paid off. By 1500, Portugal controlled the entire flow of gold to Europe. The Spanish had finally kicked the Moors out of Iberian Peninsula for good, and they also wanted new lands and new markets. So powerful were Spain and Portugal that in 1493, Pope Alexander VI, who was not really a nice guy, drew an arbitrary north-south line across the globe. By doing this, he divided the world into spheres of influence, the Spanish half and the Portuguese half. This agreement is better known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, after the town where the Spanish and Portuguese envoys met in 1494 to adjust the border a little bit. It is a testimony to the arrogance of the crowned heads of Europe and the Catholic Church to think that the entire New World could really be divided into two parts. The second European, if we're going to count the Vikings first, to reach the Americas was Cristobal Colon, an Italian far better known as Christopher Columbus. Chartered by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand de Isabella, Columbus's first expedition reached what is now the island of San Salvador on October 11, 1492. He thought he'd landed in India. Columbus spent the next 5 months exploring the area, looking for gold, and enslaving the natives. Since he thought that he was in India, he called the natives Indians. Columbus's 3 subsequent expeditions took him to Cuba, Mexico, Honduras, and Venezuela. Columbus never reached the mainland of the modern United States, and he really never got anywhere close to India. The lands he supposedly discovered were named after another explorer. But the American toehold Columbus claimed for Spain provided the base for the Spanish triumphs over the Aztecs and the Incas. The Spanish continued pushing their influence as far as they could. Hernando de Soto, an associate of the conquistador Pizarro, left Havana, Cuba with his expedition in 1539. Landing in Florida, de Soto looked for gold as far west as the Mississippi, but found very little before his death in 1542. He did, however, successfully antagonize every Indian tribe he encountered, setting a very bad precedent for European-Indian relations. Francisco de Coronado left Mexico in 1540 to find the fabulously wealthy but mythical 7 cities of Cibola. Like de Soto, he came back not a sixpence the richer, but he did manage to explore a great deal of the Southwest, as far north as modern Kansas, later known as the Mexico Territory. But de Soto and Coronado both left behind an important legacy. Dozens of Spanish horses which bred rapidly and enabled the Plains Indians to become excellent horsemen in a very short period of time. Other European powers. The other European powers envied the American wealth pouring into Spain and Portugal. They tried, mostly ineffectively, to catch up. As Spain pushed up from Central America, the French and British explored the northern portions of North America. In 1497, the Venetian explorer Giovanni Caboto, better known to his British employers as John Cabot, arrived in modern Newfoundland. The lands that Mr. Caboto discovered were not rich, but they established Britain's claim in North America for later on. The French were more energetic once they got started. Giovanni de Verrazano, a native of Florence in French pay, reached what is now North Carolina in 1524. From there, he sailed to the site of the modern city of New York. Unfortunately, he did not stake any claims. In 3 expeditions between 1534 and 1542, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River Valley, establishing France's claims in North America. The first French settlers did not find the future Canada very friendly. After a Quebec colony died out, the French tried to settle in northern Florida. Once established, the French Floridians were run out by Spanish Floridians who had been there first. Once finally established, France's North American empire included the land west of the Mississippi, later sold to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase, and north of the Great Lakes, which is a territory known as Quebec. In 1578, Queen Elizabeth I of England sent Sir Humphrey Gilbert to colonize the heathen and barbarous lands, that's a quote, in North America. 5 years later, Sir Humphrey's brother-in-law, Sir Walter Raleigh, finally got going on the mission. In 1585, Raleigh founded Britain's first North American colony on Roanoke Island. The colony failed not just once, but twice. Sweden and the Netherlands also made bids for a North American empire. In 1624, the Dutch bought Manhattan Island for a reported price of $24, and they named their settlement New Amsterdam. The city was a success, but the colony was not. Neither did the Swedish attempt from 1638 to 1655 to found a settlement on the Delaware River, The Swedish wound up giving their holdings to the Dutch in 1755. In 1674, the Dutch were forced to give their quote-unquote American empire to the British. Britain's North American empire would take longer to establish, and once it did take shape, it would become a great problem. Ah! Segment 2E, Conclusions. Most simply put, Western Europe was running out of room around 1500 AD. In many countries are assorted principalities. A principality is a land ruled by a prince. The population was growing faster than the ability to support the population. Western European countries also coveted new markets for their goods, along with wealthy trading partners. As we learned in segment 2B, these markets and new lands could not be found in the East, where the Turks and the Russians did play. So the Western Europeans literally had to discover these new lands, much as earlier civilizations had done before them, and much as later nations would do after them. They also hoped to gain the spiritual glory of bringing Christianity to the New World. 2. The old school view. When I was in high school, history textbooks still claim that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492 AD. This in turn implied a strong us and them distinction between the good Europeans who were bringing civilization and religion to those bad Indians and the bad Indians who massacred and scalped the nice, friendly Europeans. Since the Europeans thought of the Indians as savages, they considered themselves entitled to claim and rule whatever lands they could grab. The technical term for this assumption is claiming terra nullius, or nobody's land. It was all for the Indians' own good, or so we were indirectly led to believe back in the 1960s and 70s. For his role in bringing the so-called New World to European attention, the nice guy, Christopher Columbus, had statues erected and cities and even an entire country named in his honor. Not to mention universities and university towns. But the continents themselves were named after that rank latecomer, Amerigo Vespucci. 3. You discovered what? Back when I was a pup, we heard a lot less about the peoples who were actually living in the Americas when Columbus reached the Indies in 1492. The Maya, Inca, and Aztec cultures were fascinating, but they were South American empires, and they did not really directly impact American history, or so it was told. The original inhabitants of North America, the Indians, left behind no major written records, and so supposedly couldn't have left their mark on American history either. This historical view became corrected somewhat when I entered college. I once heard an Indian professor tell a class, we didn't need Columbus to discover us. We already knew we were there. It became very popular to demythologize, quote-unquote, Christopher Columbus and point out his crimes. Some of these crimes were authentic. He did kill Native Americans. He did trade in slaves. Some of these crimes are perceived. The genocide of American Indians and the institution of slavery did occur, but cannot be traced to Christopher Columbus. Even though a great deal of the Western European legacy involves slaughter and oppression of Native Americans, it's hard to argue that the world today is not a better place for the colonization of the Americas. And Christopher Columbus played a big role in that, no matter what he did or didn't discover. Ends and means, number 4. This lecture concludes by comparing the ends with the means. The Europeans who came to civilize the New World, especially the Spanish, Portuguese, British, and French, were guilty of hideous crimes against Native Americans and against African slaves. The same is true for the United States of America. This fact is something that all American citizens need to confront. On the other hand, we shouldn't cling to illusions about the Native Americans or the Africans either. The Native Americans fought with each other, practiced ethnic cleansing upon each other, built empires at each other's expense, just like the white Europeans did. They just had worse technology. Likewise, the African slave trade had its roots in African slavery, Africans enslaving other Africans, Africans who were living in developed civilizations, maintaining huge empires, and selling overseas citizens that they had conquered. The bottom line, as best I can figure it out, is that whoever yours or my ancestors may have been, white, black, brown, red, green, they could have been bald people or people of hair, we don't need to be proud of each and everything they did, to be grateful for the good things they have left us and the world they have passed down to us. And with that said, I want to get the old world out of the way before we return to our roots.